Come get some.
The 5th generation of gaming was the first time that console shooters really started to take off, with games like GoldenEye and Perfect Dark on the 64 and Medal of Honor and Power Slave on the PlayStation. But a lot of people probably don't realise that there was actually quite a few shooters that got released on the PS1 throughout the years, some good and others not so much. And I've spent the last few weeks going through pretty much all of these to see what's what, which I then thought might make a good subject for a video.
Whoa, dude, calm down.
I will say though right off the bat that for some of these, there's really not that much to talk about, especially for those which also got released on the PC. I mean, Dark Forces on the PlayStation is just more or less Dark Forces on the PC, and same thing with something like Descent. Then for certain other games, they really are that unenjoyable to play through that I genuinely couldn't bring myself to play them for more than a few minutes. In the case of one game called Shadow Master, I got motion sickness so intense that after 2 minutes it made me feel like I was going to go all into Blair and projectile vomit across my living room. Or this game called Machine Head, set in a post-apocalyptic future where you're playing as a scientist lady turned into a human tank, with her torso weirdly being kept intact, which basically means she's a combat hovercraft with tits. But I digress, because again within minutes of playing this one, I felt like I just rolled down a steep hill on the inside of a giant tire. Also in the case of light gun shooters like Time Crisis and Point Blank, I don't consider those to be traditional first person shooters, so they're not going to make the list either. But even with all of that said, there's still a hell of a lot to talk about with everything else that remains, so hold on to your butts, strap that DualShock to your nuts, and let's get into it.
I suggest you don't worry about this sort of thing and just enjoy yourself. That goes for you all, too.
And before I get too far into the video, I've got to give a quick shout out to this video's sponsor, Bespoke Post. Now, this is a monthly membership club delivering boxes of awesome, top shelf goods from relatively under the radar brands. The whole thing's free to join and you can also cancel at any time as well. What's really cool about this one is that 90% of the products come from small brands, many of which are based out in the US, like this one here, Terra, a knife made by Barebones who are based in Salt Lake City, or the Carnivore, a barbecue rubbing box made by the Great American Spice Co. in Rockford, Michigan. The Weekender's another really cool one too. Now, this is a canvas bag that's got leather handles and a reinforced frame that's clearly built to last, and there's a reason why this is one of their most popular items. Every month they introduce members to cool new products like outdoor gear, home and kitchen goods, and even live oysters, all based on a preference quiz that you fill out. And every one of these boxes of awesome has around $70 worth of goods inside, which costs you a fraction of the value. You can even preview the box before it's shipped to make sure it's something you want to keep. You can swap it out for something else or even skip that month at no charge. And they're constantly changing from month to month, so you never end up getting the same one twice. So if you want to get in on this and get 20% off your first box of awesome, well then head on over to bespokepost.com/gmanlives or use the promo code gmanlives20 at checkout. Right, so first up we've got Alien Resurrection, developed by Argonaut Software, creators of the awesome and highly coveted Star Fox for the SNES, and then the not so awesome Catwoman video game. Much like Star Fox pushed the capabilities and limits of the Super Nintendo, Alien Resurrection does the same for the PlayStation, and visually this is easily one of the best looking games ever made for the console. With impressive texture work, atmospheric lighting, but more than that, just amazing sound design, giving off a really unsettling and at times terrifying vibe.
I'm in danger!
It's the kind of aesthetic that countless indie games try to go for these days, but something that Resurrection just pulls off effortlessly. And there's definitely something appealing about the limitations of the PS1 and how it's affected how these environments look. I always kind of looked at this thing like Doom 3 before Doom 3 was even a thing, and I have no doubt that this campaign influenced countless other shooters that followed, as it really is one of the earliest examples of a first-person survival horror game. Even if you just look at it as a movie tie-in, it's also surprisingly good, letting you play as numerous characters from the movie, like Ripley and Call, even using the same looking weapons and exploring some familiar looking environments. Plus, it also benefits from being one of the few shooters for the PS1 that actually supports the mouse, which makes the whole thing somewhat less difficult, where it goes from ball-crushingly hard to just crushingly hard. And I say that because despite everything else that Alien Resurrection does right, it is still insanely hard, even on the so-called easy difficulty, to the point that it really does often feel unfair at times. Yeah man, this thing really puts the survival in survival horror, and make no mistake Sonny Jim, this game doesn't like you. In fact, in space, nobody likes you.
They don't like you, I don't like you.
You got manual save points, you've got limited health items, extremely limited weapons and ammo, and then dozens of xenomorphs to contend with who can all kill you in a matter of hits. Not to mention human enemies with guns who are arguably even more dangerous. I mean, you don't see these guys fucking each other over for a goddamn percentage.
You don't see them fucking each other over for a goddamn percentage.
This campaign is so challenging to the point that if you're too overzealous with ammo and health items early on, well, then it's possible to more or less softlock yourself in the later missions. That is to say that if you waste too many bullets in stage 1, by the time you get to stage 5, you're going to be dealing with the ramifications. And that's all kind of to the game's detriment, because difficulty aside, it's actually pretty fun to play. It just needed some more playtesting to balance this stuff out and some of those other factors. I genuinely do not believe that anyone has ever managed to beat this without cheating, which makes it even more ludicrous, when the developers claimed that they were able to beat the whole thing using nothing but a pistol, which is one of the dumbest things I've ever heard since CM Punk said he wanted to become a UFC fighter. But as an early example of first-person survival horror, this thing is a masterclass in terms of the visual and audio design. And I'm still hopeful that someday, someone can come along and re-release this thing on the PC and balance all this mess out. Continuing that Alien theme, up next is one of my all-time favorites for the console, and that's Alien Trilogy, developed by Probe Entertainment in 1996, making it one of the earliest shooters for the platform. Now, I look back really fondly on this one, mostly because it was one of the games that came with our PlayStation when we first bought it. And I still remember my dad hooking the whole thing up and the two of us just playing through this together for like an entire afternoon.
Fucking A.
I also remember thinking that this was about as good as video games could ever possibly get, with this really cool, fully motion captured intro movie, even showing some poor Marine getting his head ripped off at the goddamn shoulders. Gameplay wise though, it's a basic, objective-based first-person shooter with multiple missions across 3 chapters, all of which reference the first 3 films. First chapter is based off Aliens, the second one takes place in a prison and a smelting plant similar to Alien 3, and then the final chapter is mostly set inside the bone ship from Alien. Enemies include face huggers, chest bursters, warriors, runners and queens, and then human enemies like security forces, rogue synthetics and alien handlers. It's all just pure fan service of the best kind, and you'll expect you'll be using a shotgun, pulse rifle and smart gun as you blast your way through each level. It also might be one of the first shooters to ever have a weapon that's got a grenade launcher alternate fire, and it's definitely one of the only shooters I've ever played where someone cocks the shotgun pump back in that manner as well. It's not without its shortcomings though. I mean, levels are mostly flat and pretty basic to navigate, and it does often devolve into just activating all the switches in a level so you can then open the way to the exit. But it still serves its purpose as being this tense, frightening experience, and the moody soundtrack combined with the dim and gritty visuals makes for a pretty nerve-wracking campaign.
Fucking A.
It's also one of the few times where that limited draw distance of the PS1 actually works in its favour, limiting your visibility and making it even more unsettling, especially when you see that lone Xeno or facehugger approaching from off in the distance. And this thing right here, along with Doom, is really one of those video games that gave me nightmares as a kid. It also has one of the most legendary cheat codes in all of gaming, apart from maybe the extra lives code for Contra, and those who know. Overall, it's one of the platform's hidden gems, and for fans of the franchise, a must play. What comes next though is the first genuinely bad game on this list, and that's Armorines Project Swarm. Armorines was released in 1999 for both the PS1 and the Nintendo 64, and it's based off the comic book of the same name that 12 people actually read, where you play as the eponymous Armorines, soldiers decked out in special suits of armor and tasked with protecting Earth from alien invasions.
An advanced, virtually indestructible fighting force.
Kinda like the PG-13 version of Starship Troopers, just with less Michael Ironside, far less horrific deaths, and full frontal shower scenes. You've got the choice from playing as either Tony Lewis or Myra Lane, but all this really affects is your starting weapon, neither of which are all that exciting anyway, and you'll spend the majority of time using these regardless because ammo for both of these is infinite and there's rarely a reason to bother with anything else. Other weapons include a rocket launcher, which is really just like an ultimate firing mode for that starting weapon, along with gimmicky so-called special weapons that are unique to each mission. Now this might actually be one of the shortest games to play through in the entire video, but funnily enough, it feels like one of the longest to get through, simply because of just how crappy the whole thing is. And the reason I say that is because for 99% of the campaign here, you're really just shooting the same looking alien bugs over and over. And yes, I know that the only good bug is the dead bug, but it really begs the question of how much is too much when it comes to shooting the same looking spindly alien spiders.
Would you like to know more?
I still remember a mate of mine in high school bringing this game to school one day and parading it around, only for someone to steal it from his backpack during gym class. But I think that anonymous thief actually did him a favor because it'd be more fun trying to piss away skid marks than play through this. Level design is run-of-the-mill and unexciting, involving little more than just running around these barren environments shooting those same couple of enemy types ad nauseum. But then other times it's needlessly confusing. Like this bit here, I spent a good 15 minutes completely dumbfounded before I realized that I'm supposed to shoot this wall here, which has a hidden tunnel behind it. But how I'm expected to spot that when the texture difference is minimal at best is anyone's guess. Then you've got other even more tedious objectives like navigating a maze inside a pyramid and shooting a couple of dozen alien eggs, which is, yeah, absolutely riveting. Despite coming out in 1999 as well, when most developers were really starting to know better, this is one of those games that doesn't have checkpoints either. So if you die during a mission, which can be split across multiple stages and multiple loading screens, then you gotta go right back to the beginning of the entire thing when you're killed. And of course, too, to top the whole thing off, it all looks and runs like complete shit. The Nintendo 64 version does fare slightly better than the PS1, looking and running a little bit better, and doesn't seem to have a cardiac arrest as often, but they're still just really crappy games, man. And there's a good reason why you never hear anyone talking about it, so yeah, hopefully it stays that way.
Would you like to know more?
Speaking of games you never hear people talking about, next up is Codename Tenka, which sits in this weird cusp, somewhere between the earlier and more simplistic shooters for the console, but then also without it being as advanced or interesting as some of the later ones. And when you consider that Power Slave, Disruptor, and even Quake II had already come out by this point, it makes it seem even more basic in comparison. Right, so Codename Tenka was developed by Psygnosis and released in '97, and my first introduction to this one, along with, a whole bunch of other people, was when it was on one of those old demo discs that they used to hand out like candy back then. When the game was fully released, it came out to a surprisingly positive response, and I've got to admit that I never quite understood the praise that this thing got. I swear that reviewers back then only played like the first 2 or 3 levels before then giving their score, because if they'd have kept playing, I'm certain they'd be shaving a few points off those 7 or 8 out of 10 verdicts. Fuck! In Codename Tenka, you're playing as a guy named Joe Tenka, yeah, that's literally his name, trying to stop a conglomerate called Trojan Incorporated, whose main crime seems to be little more than just creating highly annoying and hostile mutants. And you do this by going level to level and shooting the same 2 or 3 looking ones repeatedly while completing all these basic objectives. Visually, it's not the worst looking game, and I actually kind of like that grungy pixelated aesthetic they've got going on here, but even when I bumped up the gamma on my capture card, the whole thing is still darker than a coal miner's butthole. Doesn't help either that levels are mostly cramped interior corridors where it feels like the walls are closing in on you, and then at other times they flat out recycle certain levels and have you play them in a different order. You can't jump either, so most of the time you get up and down between floors by using ramps, and even worse than that, you've got to aim up and down using the shoulder buttons, which is insanely clunky. Despite there being a whole bunch of games that made use of the thumbsticks by this point, Tenka wasn't one of them, and the only saving grace there is an auto-aim system which thankfully does most of the work. But even then with this thing, it's more like 60% of the time it works every time.
That doesn't make sense.
Story is mostly told through brief cinematics and during dialogue in the loading screens, and the voice acting during these is laughable at the best of times.
Are you worried about me? Huh? Are you concerned? Well, without me, it appears you are nothing. I want to destroy this place to stop them creating more things.
We did 20 ticks, and that was the best one.
Instead of multiple guns to choose from, you've only got one weapon, which has got multiple firing modes, kind of like the Lawgiver in Judge Dredd, only much more lame. And while your starting weapon is more or less just a rifle, you can eventually upgrade it to have double or triple shots. Then there's a laser, grenade, and eventually a rocket launcher. The worst thing though are the enemies, which are so bizarre in design and appearance, assuming you can even see them to begin with. And I've got no idea how damage is actually calculated during combat, because the amount of times I went from full health to death in a nanosecond was just too many to count. Other enemies have this really weird habit of like attaching themselves to you, outright just clipping through your body, at which point all you can really do is just wait for the sweet release of Death's cold embrace. What's even worse than that though are the enemies who launch missiles, and half the time they fire these things off without any kind of warning. Oh yeah, and of course it doesn't have checkpoints either, so have fun replaying entire missions over and over, bitch. I will say one thing in the game's favour though, and that's that it does have an awesome soundtrack, the kind of thing that instantly stuck out to me, which was kind of like a shining beacon of light in a swamp of muck and excrement. It almost kind of sounds like something out of an Unreal game, like something Alexander Brennan would compose, plus it also fits into that futuristic theme that they've got going on perfectly. Overall, I'd maybe call it a cult classic, but that's kind of an insult to cults, and although at the end of the day it is a serviceable shooter, there's just far too many antiquated features that really haven't been kind to it over time. But as far as games go, that you play as a man named Joe Tenka, well, it's easily one of the best.
And why can't he save me now? From the pain!
That doesn't make sense.
Next up, we're going to the land of the rising sun, where sumo wrestling, sushi, and animated pornography are king, with Crime Crackers 1 and 2. Two games which never even got released outside of Japan, with the first game being one of the launch titles for the PS1. Playing as bounty hunters in a galaxy far, far away, you're flying around the solar system in your Dolphin spacecraft, bringing criminals to justice, mostly just by shooting them with brightly coloured projectiles. The whole thing kind of controls like the original System Shock, where you have to stop moving and first activate the crosshair before being able to shoot at enemies, which becomes a bit of a handicap when trying to avoid certain attacks. But then it also kind of feels like a dungeon crawler at times, with the movement style, the UI, plus those limited resources for health and ammo. The real issue is just the absolutely repetitive layout to some of these missions, where you'll see the same looking corridors and walls copy-pasted over and over. The mechanic of being able to swap between bounty hunters is kind of neat though, as they each have their own weapon attacks and health bar, but then for some reason they all share the same energy bar for weapons, which really doesn't make a lot of sense. But by far the biggest problem with this one is that I can't understand what the fuck is happening, because I can read and write Japanese about as well as I can make balloon animals out of a donkey's dick. That is to say, I can't.
Nice cock.
In 1997, they released the sequel, Crime Crackers 2, which is a noticeable improvement on the first game in pretty much every way. For starters, it's got these all-new, brand spanking animated cutscenes in between each mission, which are really polished and well done. The in-game engine is also a lot more detailed, with better looking enemies, much more elaborate boss fights, weapon effects, plus you've got 4 characters to swap through now instead of just 3. But even better than that is each character has their own individual energy bar for weapons. What's most interesting about this one though is that it has multiple routes throughout the campaign, because each time you beat the game, which takes maybe like an hour or so, you can unlock new routes which offer up entirely new missions and storylines. During the first playthrough, for instance, there's boss encounters that are literally unbeatable, but after coming back for a second or third time, you can unlock the means to get past them. Apparently all up there's about 8 routes in total, so if you want to go in and replay this thing 8 times to see them all, well, be my guest. But again, I can't really see the point of doing that, considering everyone may as well be speaking in tongues. But overall, Crime Crackers 2 has an easy to understand and pick up gameplay loop. It's just a bit of a shame that it never got translated. Next up is Delta Force Urban Warfare, released in 2002, and one of the best examples of redundancy you're ever going to see. This one was actually developed by Rebellion, the guys who made the AVP games, Judge Dredd vs. Death, and even the Sniper Elite series, which, problems aside, are still the greatest Nazi testicle shooting simulators ever made.
Down population, you bro!
Now, the original Delta Force games on the PC were these tactical military sims set on giant open maps, some of which could be square kilometers in size, and in a lot of ways were also precursors to games like Battlefield. And then for some reason, someone thought it was a good idea to completely change all of that with urban warfare, and put you into these cramped interior environments, trading shots with brain-dead enemies at medium to close range. You're playing as a guy named John Carter, not to be confused with the Disney movie of the same name, and definitely not to be confused with Detective John Kimball.
My name is John Kimball, and I love my car.
And John's basically just a one-man army going up against this terrorist organization, which really makes it about as generic as a shooter could ever possibly get, with awful controls and bullet-sponge enemies. It all just feels like an odd mix of Siphon Filter, Metal Gear Solid, and Soldier of Fortune, and it's easily one of the worst shooters available on the console. Now, I say it reminds me of Metal Gear Solid because of the high focus on storytelling and cinematics, along with the fact that it has this half-assed tacked-on stealth system, where enemies can call in reinforcements along with a similar-looking radar. Plus, like Metal Gear Solid, all of the cinematics are done using the in-game engine, which is fine, only these are always incredibly dull to sit through. Character models are super basic too, but then for some reason they've modeled the teeth in, which makes everyone look like zombified monkeys.
My friend's probably outside already.
Then I say it reminds me of Soldier of Fortune because you're playing as a Special Forces soldier again named John, taking on a terrorist group who's trying to let off a biological weapon. One of the missions even takes place on a tanker, similar to one of the early missions in Soldier of Fortune 2, a game which also came out that same year, by the way. There's even a Spaz 12, which was a weapon that featured heavily in Soldier of Fortune and kicked all kinds of ass. Here though in Delta Force, it's probably one of the worst shotguns I've ever seen in a video game.
What the hell was that?
And I think you're better off attacking enemies with fucking Nerf darts. Missions are also just short and boring, moving from room to room, shooting the same looking enemies with either an M4, MP5, and later on an M249. None of which really seem to differ all that much though, and you'll see these guys shrug off multiple bullets regardless of what you hit them with either way. You could even be forgiven for thinking that this is an early PS1 game, going off how bad the whole thing plays and looks, which makes it even more staggering to think that it actually came out in 2002. Doesn't help that the entire game is set at nighttime either, with every mission looking dark and dingy and it being impossible to see more than a few feet ahead of you. And then ironically, those night and the heat vision modes somehow make it even harder to see what's going on. The frame rate often drops into single digits at times, and some missions are even broken up with short loading screens when you enter new areas. So overall, it's not the kind of thing you want to see in a game which came out so late into the console's lifecycle. And that's really the whole point. I mean, this thing came out when the PS1 had already become redundant. The PlayStation 2 had been out for almost 2 years by now, and both Medal of Honor Frontline and Time Splitters 2 had even come out that same year. And I mean, looking at those two side by side along with Delta Force makes this whole thing seem even more pathetic.
It's pathetic.
And I genuinely feel sorry for those poor clueless parents who would have bought this thing thinking they were doing the right thing. Not to mention the poor developers who are forced to work on a dated platform. The Delta Force series definitely lost its way near the end there, and Urban Warfare is a perfect case study as to why that happened.
It's pathetic.
But now we're finally getting into the good shit with 1996's Disruptor, developed by Insomniac Games, the very same Insomniac Games who worked on the Ratchet & Clank and Spider-Man series. And despite being one of their earliest titles, this is actually a pretty decent little shooter, especially considering the time that it came out. In Disruptor, you're playing as a guy named Jack Curtis, working for the futuristic Lightstormer Corps, which are more or less like privatized space marines with superpowers. In-game, these powers are called sonic implants, and all up, there's 5 of these in total. You've got Shock, Drain, Heal, Blast, and Shield. And they all get unlocked one by one as you progress through the campaign and earn your stripes, with there being 8 missions in total. In between each of these missions are some hilariously bad live-action cinematics which have outright porno movie production qualities. At least I hope they do anyway, and I'm not just projecting.
We've been scanning the solar system for someone with strength, wisdom, and integrity. Someone we could trust with man's most powerful weapon.
Either way though, if Steve Rambo popped up during any of these, it honestly wouldn't surprise me.
Just remember, think fast, shoot fast, and kick ass. Without further interruption, let's celebrate and suck some dick.
The sets look like they're made out of cardboard. The uniforms everyone wears looks like the kind of thing you'd find in Google Images if you searched for army costume. And then the outfit that Jack wears when he's a fully fledged Lightstormer makes him look like a bitch-arsling Quay.
Got a good point.
But apart from that though, Disruptor is a really solid shooter that's aged surprisingly well. It's got that combination of 3D environments combined with 2D sprites for weapons and enemies, but the sheer amount of visual variety between missions keeps everything really interesting. And you never do see the same looking area back to back. I mean, you've got ice levels, there's lava levels, space levels, gas levels, and the view distance fog never feels like it's handicapping the player. In fact, it actually works in making the environment seem much more unique, as almost every mission has a different color theme going on. You sure can't knock the enemy variety either. You've got rogue robots, there's giant wasps, alien gorillas, space pirates that look more like space Madonnas, and even Ed 209 clones.
You now have 15 seconds to comply.
The weapons are interesting as well, from pistols and rifles through to whatever the fuck this thing is, which looks like a bunch of metal dildos. Perfect for hitting 3 separate targets that are standing evenly apart. It's even got its own BFG in the form of the Zodiac, which is great at almost emptying entire rooms. The psionic implants are somewhat of a redundant mechanic at times though, simply because you don't ever really have to use them to progress, and a lot of the time you'll spend more effort getting your energy back up than actually expending it. But it does mostly work in tandem with the shooting aspect and helps to mix the combat up. The only problem it really has is that it is a pretty short game, taking anywhere from 2 to 3 hours to beat, and only a couple of the missions are really all that likely to get your balls in a knot. Like this one here, where you've got to run through the area and shut down a reactor before it explodes, is going to take a good half dozen attempts until you finally nail it. Most of the time though, it's perfectly manageable, and it even has mid-mission checkpoints, which for a game from 1996 to have, leaves no excuse at all for any of these other games to not include.
Continue point reached.
So as far as PS1 shooters go, this is easily one of the better ones, and it's kinda crazy to think that this game tanked and was a so-called commercial failure, which is weird because it really feels like a game that understood the assignment and worked within the capabilities of the console. And the fact that it runs so smoothly for almost its entire duration means that it's still fun to play through even in the current day. So yeah, all up, I ain't got nothing against Disruptor, you know? This one's alright in my books.
Mission complete.
Oh shit, I'm sorry.
Next up is an all-time classic, and that's the PlayStation port for Doom, released in 1996, which is arguably one of the best ports ever made, developed by the now defunct Williams Entertainment. Unlike Doom 64, which was an all-new experience with entirely new maps and sprite work, Doom on the PS1 is more or less the original game carried over, just with some pretty fundamental differences. And even if you've already played this on the PC, there's still so many reasons to play through this version as well, if only to discover all the various ways it's been modified to work on the limitations of the console, which is nothing short of black magic. In terms of value, it's almost impossible to fault, and you not only get the entirety of Doom 1 here, but also more or less the entirety of Doom 2. The first two games being connected also means you'll see enemy crossover in Doom 1, so it's common to see chain gunners in some of those earlier maps, and then even later on in the first episode you'll come across Revenants as well, which is definitely a bit of a shock to turn the corner, and then see one of these assholes milling about with zombie men and shotgun sergeants. Later in episode 2 you'll see Hell Knights and Arachnotrons as well, so there's a lot of novelty in replaying through these familiar levels and seeing these new enemy placements. Plus it's got the inclusion of the Nightmare Spectres, these Shadow Dimension Pinky Demons who have way more health points and look a lot more menacing. Sadly, both the Spider Mastermind and the Archvile are missing though, which is a bit of a bummer for the former because of how iconic that thing is, but probably a good thing for the latter, considering those Archviles are a pain in the balls anyway. Also appreciate how you keep your weapons across each episode now, seeing as you're playing every level back to back instead of it resetting after every 8. Now, whilst Doom 64 might often be credited as being the first game in the series to take a horror-based approach, with that much more sinister soundtrack by Aubrey Hodges, what a lot of people might not know is that this version really beat it to the punch. There's a noticeable shift in how this feels on the PC to how it feels on the PS1. Not just in the sound of the music, but also the lighting, which is a lot more darker and atmospheric, using colours to much greater effect. It actually runs pretty well too, all things considered, which when compared to Doom's other console ports on the SNEX, the 32X or the dreaded 3DO, it puts it in even higher standings. It's not entirely perfect though, and yeah, some maps do have some pretty hefty slowdown. Most of the 4th episode is the biggest offender here, which is doubly an issue because of how dogshit that whole episode is to begin with.
He's right, you know. And
in fact, if you use the BFG too much here, it can also literally crash the game, which I found out the hard way.
Oh, shit!
So yeah, not completely ideal, but if this was the only way you could play Doom at the time, well, it could have been a hell of a lot worse. I'm just still really impressed by the game's password system, which not only remembers what level you were up to, but also the amount of weapons, ammo, health, and armor you had, which for people who still didn't have a memory card back then was an absolute godsend. They followed it up later that year with a final Doom port as well, which is more of the same, and one of the few games on the console to have mouse support. Though I think playing this thing with a mouse actually ends up being a bit of a handicap. Still though, both of these stand the test of time, as does that incredibly dope box art. And if you don't want to go and play it on an actual PS1, but are still curious, well, then there's a really good mod that lets you play through the entire thing on the PC. Either way, a great port for a great game, and one that proves that you really can run Doom on anything. So how sad is it then that after talking about how awesome the Doom port was, that I have to talk about how crappy the Duke Nukem 3D port is. Duke Nukem Total Meltdown was released in 1997, and whereas the PS1 port for Doom made the necessary compromises so the whole thing could run properly, this version of Duke Nukem 3D feels like it hasn't done any of that, and it's really just a vastly worse off version of the original game. And that's really the main thing it has going against it, because it really might be the worst possible way to play Duke Nukem 3D, and I will never understand how some people can defend this. The biggest offender has to be that appalling frame rate, which is rarely steady and at times drops down into single digits, making it unplayable. So I don't know, maybe the Total Meltdown in the title refers to what it's doing to your PS1's processor whenever you try to play this abomination. If that's not enough, it's also an absolute memory card slut, using up to 5 slots in total when saving your progress, as opposed to the usual standard of, 1. You got 3 slots up used for the manual save point, and then another 2 used up by the quick save, and you will absolutely need to be quick saving here, because you never know which room you enter is going to cause the performance to nosedive and have you staring at a game-ending slideshow. About the only worthwhile thing about this new version is that it does have a pretty good remix of the original soundtrack, plus they've even added in some new lines for Duke. The intermission screen between levels is also all new now, showing Duke standing there with a smoke and gun barrel, and admittedly, this is pretty badass. Plus, the cinematics at the end of each episode are also redone, along with entirely new title screen art. It also somehow still keeps in all the adult content, which is pretty wild, considering the PC version got censored to shit in Australia, but you could still see pixelated boobs in all their glory on a console aimed at kids. There is an entirely new 4th episode here too, which has 7 all new levels, and these are decent enough, I don't know, I guess. But they're still privy to the same performance issues you suffer from in the main game, and hardly worth wasting your time on just to experience alone. I mean, at least if you play through Duke Nukem on the Nintendo 64, you get to see all the weird and wacky ways they've had to censor all the adult content, like seeing the porno store in the red light district change into a gun store, or the strip club turned into a Duke burger. I mean, damn son, even those new weapons in Duke 64 make it far more interesting to play through than this rubbish. Much like Doom on the PS1, there's also a mod that lets you play through these redesigned levels with the benefit of a high resolution and a steady frame rate, but curiosity aside, I can't imagine why you'd ever want to waste your time. So, in the immortal words of the king himself, blow it out your ass. But don't worry, because things are already looking up with the next game in the list, and that's Exhumed, or Power Slave, depending on which part of the world you lived in at the time. Developed by Lobotomy Software, this is one of the all-time most underrated and underappreciated first-person shooters ever, and also one of the most interesting. With vastly different versions of the game depending on whether or not you're playing on the PC or the consoles. Now, the PC version was more or less just a standard shooter running on the build engine, featuring a couple dozen levels and standard key hunting gameplay. I mean, nothing bad, but nothing amazing either. The version on the consoles, though, was a Metroidvania journey across multiple levels with a world map, backtracking to side areas, unlockable abilities, and even hidden collectibles, which would affect whether you got the good or the bad ending. I mean, even the weapons would differ slightly depending on the platform, with a revolver, machine gun, grenades, and then magical weapons like the Cobra Staff and the Ring of Ra. In fact, it's still one of the most satisfying machine guns in any first-person shooter, and about all it was ever missing was a nice boomstick. The story's pretty badass too. You're playing as a special forces soldier in the ancient Egyptian city of Karnak, working with the spirit of King Ramses to stop the Killmart, a hostile insect alien species hell-bent on taking over the planet. And although early on, about all you can do is run and jump your way through the levels, by the end of the campaign you'll be able to levitate, walk on lava, breathe underwater, and pass through force fields. And if you get the good ending, you more or less become a god. Yeah, like I said, badass. All combined with one of the best soundtracks of all time. Just got a really good combination of shooting, platforming, and exploration to make it feel like a journey you want to get invested in. And the side task of finding all these collectibles to get that good ending was even more motivation. There wasn't that many enemy types, but they were all pretty memorable, and the sprite work was really gruesome, showing lots of blood and guts when they were killed. It's always been one of those games I come back to and replay through every few years, which has always been a bit of a shit fight digging out the old PS1 and hooking the whole thing up for another run. Well, the good news is that since 2022, I won't have to do that anymore, because Night Dive Studios remastered it with Power Slave Exhumed, which makes it infinitely more accessible and also easier to get into, and gives people like you even less of an excuse for not having played it, bitch. So if you only have one takeaway from this entire video, it's that you should go and check this one out, right now. Now, Expert is another Japanese exclusive released in 1996, and it's kind of like a mix between Die Hard and Spriggan. I say it's like Die Hard because the plot seems to be about a building taken over by terrorists, and then I say Spriggan because the character you're playing as looks a lot like you Omanai, and the unit you're working for seems to be comprised of equally badass looking dudes. Then during this cheesy intro cinematic, you've got a guy on top of a skyscraper doing his best T-800 impression, shooting at a nearby chopper with the goddamn minigun. That's a damn minigun! So I guess we can add Terminator 2 to the mix as well.
Chill out, dickwad.
Visually, it also reminds me a lot of Operation Body Count if it was ever made by developers who weren't completely fucking incompetent. And then to make it even more confusing, I've read that bootleg copies of this game were sold in certain countries under the title of Counter-Strike. Gameplay-wise though, it shares more in common with the early days of the genre like Wolfenstein 3D, with entirely flat levels and basic architecture, being little more than just the same looking corridors and the same few enemy types. But they mix things up a bit here by giving you different objectives. For instance, for some of the floors, the power's gone out and you're walking around in night vision goggles, Buffalo Bill style, until you can turn the lights back on. And then on other floors you have to find and rescue hostages. It even gives you the option of being able to choose your own loadout at the beginning of each mission, with there being a MAC-10 silenced pistol and a shotgun among the available weapons. So in its defense, there is some variety to the gameplay outside of just shooting bad guys. And that's all fine, but the issue again comes from that language barrier, and I could only really play through this until I couldn't. I was able to get through the first 5 or so levels without any real dramas, despite not really knowing what the hell was going on. But when I got up to a level which had me defuse a bomb is where that all just came to an end. Because for some idiotic reason, the order and the placement of wires you have to cut is completely randomized every time you attempt it. And the fact it's also at the end of the mission means you have to replay the 10 minutes preceding it every single time. I don't know, I guess you need to be an expert in anger management to get past this section. Hey? I would have absolutely kept playing after this mission if I was able to get through it, but I'm not going to keep coming back and attempting something over and over until I magically guess the correct combination. When I got better things to do with my time, man. You know, like make a video about FPS games on the PS1 that no one ever asked for.
You are one pathetic loser.
It is a shame too, because I think the shooting feels fun enough, and the art style is really appealing with its own unique vibe, but I may as well be attempting to play through it blindfolded for that bomb defusal, because I think I'd have about as much luck there getting through it at that point.
Greetings, mortal. Are you ready to die?
No!
Next up we got Hexen, which is another one of my all-time favorites. And as a sequel to Heretic, it's a crushing, dark and depressing journey through multiple realms as you stop the second Serpent Rider Korax. And with 3 playable heroes to choose from, each with their own unique weapons and abilities, completing it felt like beating someone to death with a Rubik's Cube. Sadly though, this version isn't doing it any favours, and much like Duke Nukem Total Meltdown, this is really just another port which is objectively a worse off version than its PC counterpart, pretty much in almost every single way. This thing doesn't just have a bad frame rate, but it even takes it one step further with slowdown. And truthfully too, some of the absolute worst slowdown I've ever seen, to the point that it almost feels like you've activated bullet time. Speaking of Duke Nukem as well, if you thought that that game was a bit of a memory card whore, well, wait until you get a load of this beast, because saving your game here uses up an entire memory card.
May God have mercy on us all.
Yeah, that's right, a grand total of 15 fucking slots, you know, for anyone who's still counting. This version does feature quick saves, which are a blessing, but the loading times for these is also really long, ranging anywhere from 30 to 60 seconds. I mean, even just the loading screens in general can take up a whole lot of time as well, and in the kind of game where you're frequently jumping into portals, hopping from area to area, and quick saving on top of it, it makes the gameplay very inconsistent. Because you often feel like you're spending more time staring at loading screens than you are, you know, actually playing the game. Then you get into the actual gameplay and realize you're basically experiencing a loading screen anyway, as the performance is so bad it's like the game is actively trying to load everything in real time right in front of you. The one saving grace here, kind of, is that this port has these unique CGI cinematics in between each hub, and also a new intro showing what happened in Kronos before Korax showed up. So for a Hexen fan, seeing a new perspective on these characters and how events panned out is definitely kinda cool, but is that enough to make me want to keep playing through it though?
No!
This is yet again another instance as well where the Nintendo 64 version beats it on almost every front. Not only does it look and run better on the 64, but it also has the added benefit of a co-op mode, which is pretty damn rad. This version is also a bit of a greedy whore when it comes to using up save slots, but it's still a damn sight better than whatever the hell you want to call this PS1 port. All I can say here is that Hexen deserved better. We all did.
My servants can smell your blood, human.
What is without a doubt the most lighthearted couple of games in this entire video is 1995's Jumping Flash and then 1996's Jumping Flash 2. The former being one of the launch titles for the console for the 12 or so people who are old enough to remember what that was like.
Alright!
Now, this isn't a first-person shooter in the traditional sense. I mean, you still do shoot enemies and all that, but it's more of a first-person platformer, kinda like Mirror's Edge, only without that chilled-out ambient aesthetic. I'm pretty sure too that this is one of the first 3D platformers ever made. Now I know that Super Mario Bros. 64 is often credited as being one of the earliest examples and pioneers, which it is, but Jumping Flash is without a doubt one of, if not the first ones to do it from a first-person perspective, and more than that, do it well. The story is you're playing as a robotic rabbit named Robert, and just think about that for a second, searching for missing jet pods on various tiny planets for an evil astrophysicist named Baron Aloha can claim them. That is literally the plot. Each level begins with you being dropped into a different environment, which feels like a kiddie play park, if one of those was ever dangling above an abyss that led into the Phantom Zone. And then you've got to run, shoot and hop around to find all 4 jet pods before making your way to the exit. Each world has 3 levels, and then the 3rd level of each world ends in a boss fight, and that's about all you need to know.
And that's all I have to say about that.
Thankfully, Jumping Flash has some pretty smooth controls, which is kinda surprising considering its age, and doubly surprising considering its camera perspective. You can jump up to 3 times in midair to propel yourself further, and in an absolute stroke of genius, someone made it so that Robert looks down at his feet when descending, so you can make sure you're landing right where you want to. You can even use its shadow as something of a crosshair to help you aim. It's really just a charming, colourful and fun little platformer that doesn't seem to have any delusions of self-grandeur, and it does what it does well. In 1996, they followed it up with a sequel, Jumping Flash 2, Flash with a Vengeance, where instead of trying to stop Baron Aloha, you're now kind of working alongside him to stop the absolute nightmare fuel that is the new bad guy, Captain Kabuki. I guess the old saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, has never rung more true. Along with the old saying that putting demonic eyes and red lipstick on a giant dildo head is fucking terrifying. I mean, Jesus Christ, man, get a look at this thing. And this was aimed at kids. There is undeniably something really unsettling about this horrific-looking entity just floating there in the vast emptiness of space with that creepy smile on his face. This sequel does feel like a bit more of an expansion pack than a proper sequel though, with it really just being more of the same, only this time instead of trying to find jet pods, you're now rescuing those moo-moos, which were the main enemy forces in the first game. Still though, for the brief time it lasts, it never fails in making my asshole pucker up tight enough to crush soda cans, as it has me leaping over bottomless pits and collecting all those poor defenseless little moo-moos on all the different levels.
Got them all!
So it's really just more of a good thing, which at the end of the day isn't anything worth complaining about.
All right!
I mean, it all might look old and dated by today's standards, which it is, but Jumping Flash's soul and charm still shines through almost 2 decades later. And it's kind of funny to think how little you hear people talking about this one, considering the influence it undoubtedly had in the years and the games to come. Overall, again, good shit.
That's that.
Now, back in 1997, there were 3 movies that were absolutely huge at the time. You had Titanic, Jurassic Park 2, and then Men in Black. And as a kid growing up during that era, the Men in Black cartoon series as well, which still has one of the coolest intros of all time. Second only to Batman the Animated Series, obviously. And although there were Men in Black video games, it wasn't until 2001 when it felt like they finally got it right, with Men in Black Crashdown developed by Runecraft.
Well, if it ain't my favorite agents.
And much like Delta Force Urban Warfare, this thing came out towards the end of the PS1's life cycle. However, luckily for us, unlike Delta Force, Men in Black Crashdown isn't complete garbage. What it is though is a really fun, character-filled shooter with some creative visuals and mostly competent shooting, with each mission feeling like an episode of the cartoon as you either play as Agent J or K, and walk in shadow, move in silence, guard against extraterrestrial violence. You've got an opening level set in a carnival ghost train, classic. There's a level later on when it goes all Honey I Shrunk the Kids and you shrunk down and have to chase after some insect.aliens in someone's backyard. And then later on you'll even get to explore the MIB headquarters for one of the final missions, seeing some very familiar looking areas. It's also got a really good soundtrack with some super catchy tunes on top of everything else. But regardless of where you are, the visuals are colourful, vibrant, and varied. And outside of shooting the same few aliens over and over, it always feels like you're in a totally different backdrop, so that repetition of the combat becomes less tedious. There's some pretty fun weapons here too, most of which are from either the movie or the cartoon series. Like the J2 pistol, you've got the Series 40 atomizer, the reverberating carbonizer with mutating capacity, and of course the best gun of all.
Noisy cricket.
I feel like I'm gonna break this damn thing.
There's even something called an ionic tickler, which sounds like something you'd find in your mum's purse. Then near the end of the campaign, you've got something called the Awful Truth, which looks like the rocket launcher from Unreal Tournament, but is more or less like a plasma minigun. Oh yeah, and how could I forget the best weapon in the MIB arsenal, the old neuralizer. So you two can go around telling dumbfounded civilians that all they really saw was swamp gas from a weather balloon getting trapped in a thermal pocket and reflecting the light from Venus. Hypnotizer, neuralizer, vivid memories.
Turn to fantasies, ain't no MIBs, can I please?
About the only dumb design choice they've got here is how they take away all your weapons at the beginning of each mission. Plus, this truly has some of the worst grenade hitboxes I've ever seen, with these things passing straight through enemies. But even still, this was a genuine surprise to play through. More so because I'd also seen those aggregate scores that this thing got before I'd even played it, which didn't paint it in a positive light. I don't think people realise or maybe even remember just how crappy most movie or TV show tie-in games were from this era, so for something like this to be as fun as it was, well, it really was defying convention.
Sorry for the disturbance, ma'am.
And again, I will never understand the mindset of certain game journalists. Considering this thing got a 59 on Metacritic, which is more or less like a 6 out of 10 at that point, which is kind of insulting given its uniqueness and overall content. this one was just a victim of bad timing, I think, more than anything else, because, again, by this point, most people had probably moved on to the PS2, which meant that another PS1 shooter coming out probably just seemed like a waste of time, especially for a cartoon series that was at the end of its tether and a second movie that hadn't even been made yet. Either way though, definitely another one of those hidden gems that most people forgot about or didn't know existed in the first place. And still a hell of a lot better than that awful PS2 game, of which I still can't even beat its first fucking level. Finally, we get to easily what's two of the best games in this video, and that's Medal of Honor and Medal of Honor Underground. The first one being where the whole thing started for this popular franchise, and arguably two of the best games ever made for the PS1, as far as shooters are concerned. Was released in 1999 and developed by DreamWorks Interactive, with Steven Spielberg even heavily involved in the development, and claiming he got the idea for the whole thing after watching his son play GoldenEye on the Nintendo 64. And in a lot of ways you can almost kind of look at this as Sony's answer to Nintendo's GoldenEye, but it's also far more than that in so many ways. I mean, this thing is primarily responsible for the rise in popularity of World War II shooters throughout the early to mid 2000s. Most notably with games like Call of Duty, which is kind of crazy to think that even Warzone wouldn't exist without Medal of Honor. I mean, ain't that a scary thought? Medal of Honor was also much more cinematic than most people were used to, with a memorable soundtrack created by film composer Michael Giacchino, which was the kind of thing that you just didn't see in gaming much at that time. The story takes place during the Second World War as you're playing as OSS operative Jimmy Patterson, carrying out various solo missions behind enemy lines across Europe, and instead of being run and gun, it was more like stand and shoot. Because just like GoldenEye, you could bring up this manual aiming reticle to be more precise if you were standing still, which became really handy for going for those much needed headshots. Then it also changed things up with all the stealth missions where you went undercover and snuck around these German bases, flashing fake documents at checkpoints to get further into enemy territory.
Who are you? It won't happen again.
Yeah. Hi.
Still remember one of those earlier missions where you're running from the soldiers in the Paris sewers and can hear whistles being blown and German shepherds barking off in the distance, only to then find a shotgun in a French resistance stash and turn the tides on your pursuers. And there really was no other game quite like this at the time. Still has really impressive enemy AI and animations as well, like seeing enemies kick away live grenades or watching them react dynamically to being shot. You could even shoot the helmets off their head if you're accurate enough and watch it bounce around on the ground. Barely a year later, in the year 2000, they followed it up with Medal of Honor Underground, changing things around and letting you play as French resistance member Manon Baptiste, adding in entirely new locations, a few new weapons and enemies.
Viva la France!
This time you're fighting back against the Germans on your own turf, with the final mission even taking place during the liberation of Paris as you clear the streets of enemy soldiers. Definitely feels a bit more like an expansion pack than a full-blown sequel, but it's still really fun to play through. And those undercover missions taking photos of clueless German archaeologists still remains a highlight.
Nice to meet you. I assume someone approved this.
Plus, there's both an STG-44 and a Sten submachine gun, which are two of the best World War II era weapons, hands down. And on this, there can be no debate. Plus, of course, it's also got that highly memorable final mission where you sneak into a German castle, fight off dogs armed with machine guns, zombies, and man-sized nutcrackers. So yeah, two of the best shooters ever made for the platform, without a doubt. And the fact there's still never been any kind of proper remaster or remake for any of these, along with those other old games in the series, is something of a war crime. Now, Quake II is another game which, much like Doom and even Quake before it, got treated surprisingly well when it comes to its console ports, with versions on both the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation. But whereas Quake II on the 64 was an entirely new series of levels, the PS1 version of Quake II was much more closer to the PC, just with some noticeable changes to the architecture and layouts in certain areas, so the whole thing could, run properly. With it having only 20 levels as opposed to near 40 on the PC, and some of these being entirely unique as well, or in some cases even reused from Quake II 64, such as these new opening areas. It's still the same old story though, with the Strogg getting up to no good and causing trouble in the neighborhood, forcing mankind to attack their home planet of Strogos and take the fight to their own turf. And you're playing as the one-man army who's going to win this war single-handedly. You've got a variety of enemies to contend with, all of which showed off some pretty aggressive and impressive strategies, and on hard mode, it's easily one of the toughest shooters of its era. Where the console version differs though is that it includes a life system where if you died it respawned you at the last checkpoint, but also refilled all your health, armor and ammo, with manual saves being limited to these specific checkpoints. And again, it's one of the very few shooters for the PlayStation which supports the mouse, a feature which actually makes it much more playable this time, considering that other control scheme makes me feel like I've kinda gone cross-eyed.
Oh no, I've gone cross-eyed.
You've got all the weapons here too, from the absolutely useless blaster, the shotgun and the super shotgun, machine gun and chain gun, grenade launcher, rocket launcher, and then the hyper blaster and the BFG. This version even adds in new enemies as well in the form of these large robotic spiders which have an absolute Olympic-sized health pool, along with an all-new boss called the Guardian, which I can't help but again be reminded of Ed 209 whenever I see it.
You now have 15 seconds to comply.
Best of all though, it includes all those awesome metal tracks by Sonic Mayhem, and hearing that music play in the background while you're shooting at the Strog is as iconic as hearing Bobby Prince's tracks in Doom or Lee Jackson's stuff in Shadow Warrior. Gotta admit, I've always had a bit of a soft spot for this version of Quake II because I really did spend a whole lot of time playing through this as a teenager. In fact, I think there might have been a point there where I played through this version more than I did the one on the PC, and that dithered, pixelated look of the PS1 definitely works in the game's favour when it comes to helping it sell that really grungy aesthetic. It's just another really unique way to play a game that really did get vastly different ports depending on the platform. If push comes to shove, you're probably better off playing the PC version as God intended, but it's still a bit of a technical marvel that they managed to pull this port off at all. And if you just want to burn through this whole thing for shits and giggles, well, there's worse ways to spend an afternoon. And you know what? If it converts more people into Quake II fans, well, I'm all for it. The original Rainbow Six on PC back in 1998 is widely considered to be one of the games that really helped to popularize the tactical shooter genre, combining strategy and action into one coherent package where you could send up to 16 operatives out into these dangerous, life-threatening scenarios, planning their every move. Only to then realize your well-laid plans were complete dog shit, and you basically just sent all those people out to their death.
Man down, man down.
But it rewarded patience, planning, and foresight, and it's no wonder that it went on to spawn countless sequels and spin-offs. In fact, even to this day, one of the latest iterations, Rainbow Six Siege, is still a pretty relevant and popular competitive shooter. With yours truly even spending way too much time playing it for a while there, and doing God knows how much damage to my blood pressure along the way.
Holy shit.
So no surprise that they tried to capitalize on it all those years back and bring it to the consoles, with there again being ports for both the Nintendo 64 and, you guessed it, the PlayStation. However, sacrifices were made here to say the least, and instead of choosing up to 16 different operatives to split up into 4 different squads, now you've only got 3 operatives to put into, well, 3 squads. So yeah, just, 3 operatives all up.
Man.
And instead of being able to map out precise routes through an entire area, even down to choosing the rules of engagement and their movement speed, now you just choose from 1 of 3 different entry points and call it a day.
It's pathetic.
The only way to actually give orders to your squad now is to find them in the mission and interact with them directly. Still loosely follows the same plot and mission structure from the PC version, only these areas are barely recognizable anymore and much more simplified, and with the inclusion of actual weapon models, it almost feels like an entirely different game, which it is. Perfect example of the differences comes during the airfield mission. Now on the PC, this was a really open-ended level where enemies could come from all directions, and you were pretty free in the order you wanted to take them out. Here though, on the PS1, it's more or less just like a giant winding corridor and much more linear. Yet again as well, the Nintendo 64 port beats out the PlayStation in that regard, with the 64 port being much more like it is on the PC, which is either a good or a bad thing, depending on how you feel about choppy frame rates, and textures so blurry that they'll make you question your eyesight. What is most important though is that they brought back my boy Ding Chavez, along with all the other operatives who still had different stats and perks, and if one of them is killed during a mission, they're still gone for good, adding in that hardcore permadeath mechanic, which was really kind of unique for the time. Yeah, and don't be fooled either, man, because the combat is still hard as balls, and you can be dropped by gunfire here in absolute nanoseconds. I mean, stop, just scratch your nuts or rip a quick fart and the whole thing could be over. so as far as the console goes, like, it's really not the worst tactical shooter. The only problem is that the aiming controls are inverted by default, and there doesn't seem to be any way to swap it out, and the type of people who play shooters with inverted controls often end up becoming serial killers or anime fans, and I just think that to leave out such an important control preference just seems kind of dumb. Does also kind of suck that all of those planning mechanics for the missions are completely absent, especially since that was one of the more addictive elements in the original. But as a consolation, when they made the PS1 port for Roguesby in 1999, they more than made up for it with a really extensive planning feature, which is going to keep you busier than a one-armed Uber driver with a dick rash. Overall, there's just something kind of wholesome about this port trying to keep up with the big dogs. And I don't know, man, like, maybe it's the nostalgia talking, and I did play this version quite a lot, but I really don't think it's all that bad. The mechanic of methodically moving from room to room, peeking around corners and taking out those lurking terrorists is still the focus of every mission. And it almost feels like a horror game at times, with sudden encounters against enemies almost serving as these mini jump scares. Either way though, it's still a damn sight better than those other tactical shooters like Delta Force. I mean, that's for damn sure. Rainbow Six Lone Wolf, however, is something else entirely. Now, this was developed again by Rebellion Entertainment in 2002, even using the same engine from Delta Force Urban Warfare. But Lone Wolf in comparison makes Delta Force look like a goddamn masterpiece.
Come again.
This right here is one of the most pointless video games I've ever played, serving as this bizarre spin-off to the main entries, having you play as Ding Chavez all by himself during what's more or less just a single operation in Norway. He's heading to the country to both freeze his balls off, but also make contact with a former terrorist who's now turned informant. And he ends up having to find this contact and also deal with the other hostile terrorists in the area. You've got a very basic loadout here to choose from with different weapons and equipment, but the game suggests what to use for each mission anyway, so there's not really any point in customizing it, and choosing your entry point doesn't really affect things either, because you have to kill everything regardless. But the most pathetic thing is that there's only 5 missions all up. I mean, yeah, 5. And it seems to compensate for this short length, they've tried to make the game as idiotically hard as possible, because gunfire can still kill you in a matter of hits.
Hey. God damn it, dog! Fucking getting sick of this fucking shit!
And seeing as you're the only operative this time, when you're dead, and it's game over. It doesn't help either that trying to shoot in this game is like when you're playing Deus Ex and haven't put any points into ranged weapons yet, which means you've got to wait for the crosshair to shrink down so you can actually hit what you're aiming at. And it is beyond stupid that you're playing as Rainbow Six's golden boy, Ding Chavez himself, and yet for some reason it takes him 5 seconds just to steady his goddamn aim. And it's so frustrating to know that you should be able to hit someone, only to then be killed instead because you're still waiting for that artificial accuracy bullshit to sort itself out. Half the time I don't even hear enemies coming and I just die, with someone having somehow snuck up behind me and gotten off a lucky shot. And I mean, look at this arsehole just dropping out of the goddamn ceiling.
Hey!
You'll have your night vision goggles on 99% of the time here as well, because it makes enemies much easier to spot in the darkness, but even that's not going to save you from how frustrating this whole thing is, and the multitude of random deaths you're going to fall victim to. So this is not only the worst game in this entire video, the worst game in the entire Rainbow Six library, but also probably one of the worst shooters ever made.
He's right, you know.
And it's kind of shocking to think that people actually paid money for this garbage. Tom Clancy's probably rolling over in his grave, you know, if it weren't lined with the bags of cash from the profits he's made off this entire franchise.
Nice. Oh shit.
There you go.
Resident Evil is without a doubt one of gaming's all-time most iconic franchises, and there's so many games made for it now that you'd need some kind of flowchart to track the entire thing.
I've had enough of your bullshit!
And it all started back on the PlayStation with Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3, along with another one you don't hear people talking about as often with Resident Evil Survivor.
Resident Evil Survivor.
Even if you do hear people bringing it up, the way they talk about it, you'd think that it killed their dog or something, or took a shit in their cereal bowl. And it's definitely one of the blackest of the black sheep when it comes to the franchise.
Hang on!
Developed by Capcom and released in the year 2000, it's a combination of a light gun shooter and a first-person shooter, with a whole new separate storyline set on Sheena Island, a location which has never once come up a single time in any other game in the series. You're playing as a dude who's crashed on the island and is suffering from some short-term amnesia, to soon then discover he was sent to the island by Leon Kennedy himself.
But I just can't remember.
And it has the expected roster of enemies from zombies and lickers through to hunters, which might be one of the most frustrating iterations of these bastards yet. Survivor isn't a particularly long game, taking maybe like an hour or so to get through, but it does have a lot of replayability, as the player is able to choose from separate routes at key points in the campaign, which then leads off to entirely different areas and even gives you access to different weapons. Plus it even has its own Mr. X, another 7-foot tall tyrant that stalks you throughout most of the game, ending in a showdown on a helipad which feels a lot like the finale in the first game. Survivor is definitely kind of clunky at times, and despite having the option to play through it with a light gun, that actually ends up being a bit of a handicap, because moving around and shooting is a hell of a lot easier with the controller. This thing actually caused quite a bit of drama at the time of its release as well, because it was clearly designed with the G-Con 45 in mind, but around that same time is when the Columbine shootings happened in the US, so all of the light gun support for certain versions was removed out of respect for the victims, which is, you know, fair enough. And I know that most people tend to shit on this game for various reasons, and it's not without its faults, but I gotta be honest, I really don't think it's all that bad. And it's got that great polygonal, chunky visual style that the 5th gen entries in this series were really well known for. I mean, some of the environments still look pretty impressive for the time, and being able to see a zombie right up in your face from that first person perspective was entirely unique for the series. We've since become pretty accustomed to the first-person entries for this series, with RE7 and Village, but this really was breaking new ground. And it's kind of weird that people didn't respond to it more positively. It's always weird to me as well, as if people expected it to be some kind of fast-paced, action-packed shooter, simply because of the perspective change, and a lot of the complaints at the time seemed to come from the movement speed and the controls, as if people like suddenly forgot what Resident Evil games were like back then. I mean, like, were they expecting to pull out an RPG or a plasma rifle and start circle strafing around and shooting at zombies or something? The voice acting is suitably atrocious, but then again, I mean, that's almost to be expected.
What's happening to me?
And a Resident Evil game from back then that didn't have laughably bad voice work, well, it wouldn't be a Resident Evil game.
He told me that he could find a way to escape from this place inside the factory, but there are tons and tons of scary monsters there.
Umbrella was going to take care of me, but you had to go and screw it all up.
Stop! No!
Did 20 ticks, and that was the best one.
The sequel, however, on PS2, now that was an absolute dumpster fire. But Survivor 1 is still a pretty competent, short-lived survival horror experience. They probably just had people setting their expectations too high to really enjoy it for what it was. Still though, miles better than RE6 or Operation Raccoon City.
Stop!
South Park fans have it so good these days with games like Stick of Truth and The Fractured Butthole, but those of us who are a bit older remember the dark times with titles like Chef's Love Shack, South Park Rally, and the eponymous 1999 first-person shooter.
Come on down South Park and meet some friends, man.
And I know I'm somewhat in the minority here, but I've just never found this one all that good. I don't know, man, a game where you run around vast empty spaces throwing piss-soaked snowballs at turkeys and bludgeoning mentally challenged clones to death with dodgeballs just never did it for me. I mean, this thing was so bad that I remember reading somewhere that even Trey Parker and Matt Stone encouraged people to not play it. What hurts even more is that it was created by the Turok developers, Iguana Entertainment, and it even runs on the same engine as the Turok games. But that's about the only positive thing that they share in common.
I know, children. I heard.
And I say that because this really is one of the most monotonous and repetitive shooters ever made. In the sense that you'll be throwing the same looking snowballs at the same looking enemies, hear the same 2 or 3 lines of dialogue during combat, and listen to the same 10-second long jingle over and over for each level until the whole thing makes you want to put a skewer through your eardrums.
Make it stop!
The levels are loosely based off episodes from the first season of the show, like the episode where the town is taken over by mutant turkeys, the episode where aliens give Cartman an anal probe and cause all the cows to go mad, and then the episode where an evil clone of Stan goes on a violent rampage.
Daddy, no!
There's definitely novelty though to the cinematics, which is kind of like watching a worse off version of an actual episode.
Hello, children.
Hi, Chef.
And seeing that iconic intro recreated using the in-game engine is actually kind of hilarious. But the quality of the series itself just can't overcome how boring that gameplay is, because you're really only fighting 1 or 2 enemy types per level, be it turkeys, cows, or aliens. And you'll murder an indiscriminate amount of these things to the point that it really just does become utterly mindless. Each level's also got tank enemies, which are like tougher variants that spawn in the weaker ones, and if one of these guys gets past you before you can even progress, you'll need to defend downtown South Park from their rampage, or else you fail the entire level and have to restart from scratch. Weapons include snowballs, dodgeballs, a toilet plunger launcher, a foam dart launcher, and then explosive Terrence and Phillip fart dolls. But all the enemies feel like they've got maybe 15% more health points than they really should have, and the alternate attacks for almost every weapon does vastly more damage than the primary one, so you'll burn through all your available ammo really quickly. This was another game that got released on both the 64 and the PS1, and I know I'm kind of sounding like a broken record at this point, but it'll surprise absolutely no one to know that yet again the Nintendo 64 version is far superior. I mean, it looks better, it's smoother, and it's just far more stable, making it the ideal way to play the game. You know, if you were looking for a new method to torture yourself, and waterboarding just wasn't cutting it anymore. It probably would have benefited a whole lot more from being made for the PS2, because it feels like something that really came out one generation too early. And the damage this one did to the franchise is actually kind of telling in the fact that it took them 15-something years after this before they finally made another fully fledged game. You know, when they released The Stick of Truth in 2014. There might have been some merit as well if this had have had a proper co-op mode, because I think playing through it with 4 of your buddies would have made the whole thing much less tedious. As it is, the multiplayer mode is limited to those competitive modes, which run so fucking poorly that it's basically unplayable. So if you've got a hankering for some old school South Park, well, this isn't it. And you're better off just going back and rewatching the show.
I love to sing about the moon and the June and the springer.
Finally, we're at the end with The World Is Not Enough, and what a way to end it with the man himself, Bond.
James Bond.
And the PS1 port for the movie tie-in video game.
Well played, Mr. Bond.
Another title which, yet again, was released for both the 64 and the PlayStation in the year 2000. However, this time around, it's not quite as clear-cut as to which one is better, because both versions are entirely different. I've always kind of felt that the Nintendo 64 version was like an unofficial sequel to GoldenEye, because they're very similar games in terms of how they look, feel, and play, and also have mission objectives that change depending on the difficulty mode. The PS1 version, on the other hand, was developed by Black Ops Games and feels like it's taken influence from Medal of Honor, with a similar manual aiming system, the slower movement speed, and then some of those stealth missions have you sneaking around and flashing your credentials at enemy checkpoints, which seems kind of familiar.
Good afternoon, Dr. Arkov.
Speaking of checkpoints as well, this version doesn't have them either, and I just don't get it. I mean, did developers just flip a coin back then, and then call heads or tails as to whether or not they'd actually include them when they worked on games back then? The PS1 version also benefits from having that extra storage space of a CD over the cartridge, which means you get to see all these short clips from the movie, which, as a 13-year-old kid, was pretty damn awesome to see. You've got to remember that back then, movies didn't come out on a streaming service like a month after they'd left the cinema, so if you didn't own it on DVD, it was almost as good as watching the movie itself. Apart from that though, the campaign more or less follows the plot of the film, with set pieces and action sequences carried over.
This kind of information doesn't come for free, even for you, Mr. Bond.
The PS1 version has a unique mission though, where you get to play blackjack, which is something that was completely absent on the 64, probably because of Nintendo's whole family-friendly guidelines when it comes to content.
Well played, Mr. Bond.
But there's also a bunch of other differences as well. For instance, one stealth mission on the 64 has you sneaking around some mansion grounds at night time, and it is the absolute definition of trial and error. That same mission on the PS1, however, is completely different because you're inside the entire time, making the whole thing much more lenient, and you can even go around punching out all these guards, which is apparently non-lethal, causing them to simply fade out of existence.
Hey!
I do think in some instances as well that the PS1 missions are outright superior. Like the ski chase scene from the movie, on the 64 this is entirely on rails, where you almost have to memorize where all the enemies and health pickups are beforehand. But then on the PS1, you're in direct control of where and when Bond skis, giving you much more freedom. but then the 64 version does have an early mission set in a subway station, and look man, it's a scientific fact that subway stations, along with airports and hospitals, make the best backdrops for video games. I mean, just go play Max Payne and Soldier Fortune and you'll see what I mean. Both versions have those chunky weapon models though, which really epitomise shooters on 5th generation consoles. And I'll never get sick of seeing a P90, a TMP or an MP5 rendered with that kind of aesthetic. Now, I am definitely kind of biased in liking the PlayStation version the most, simply because I've always preferred the PS1's visuals over that blurry mess that is most 64 games. I do think that either way, both of these are really underrated shooters that barely anyone seems to talk about. And again, as a movie tie-in, it's pretty hard to fault. I mean look, this shit ain't no 007 Nightfire, but it's decent enough. And besides, any game that features Denise Richards in her absolute prime is okay by me. All up, when you go back and look at all the shooters made for the PlayStation 1, I do think the good outweighs the bad. But it is a platform that's getting increasingly less and less accessible as the years roll on by. Remasters for 64 games keep on coming hard and strong. I mean, even recently we got a full-on remaster for the Quake II 64 port, and I'd like to think as well that a Turok 3 remaster isn't that far off on the horizon. The PS1 though is kind of like this odd little relic that developers and publishers have almost completely thrown to the wayside. And it's a damn shame because a lot of these older titles still play pretty well, dust and cobwebs aside. Until Sony finally start respecting their own legacy and giving these older games the kudos they deserve, the only way to play them is to either use an emulator, which I don't recommend, or buy an actual console and play them properly. If nothing else though, I hope my video helped you get an idea of where to start and which ones might actually be worth your time if that's something you end up doing. And any excuse to spend more time with one of gaming's most important and defining consoles is alright in my books.